Good evening and welcome to JDL's talk on Michigan labor history, inspired by the 2021-2022 Great Michigan Read, The Women of the Copper Country. We have three speakers tonight. First, Dan Golodner will present Two Strikes in Two Michigan Cities, highlighting American Progressive Era strikes in Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids. These two labor actions changed politics in Grand Rapids and in Kalamazoo, and the issues raised in both strikes still resonate nationwide today. Second, Lindsay Hiltunen asks us to take a trip with me in 1913. She will explore the context, events, and aftermath of the Michigan copper miner strike of 1913 and 1914. Special attention will be paid on how the strike has been conceptualized through instances of public collective memory and memorialization. And finally, Robert Garrett will examine a slightly later time in the 20th century when labor made significant gains, yet once again, many of the gains were reversed. Please join him for a look at New Deal labor laws, a union-friendly Michigan governor, a year of many strikes and union victories, and how it went and unraveled. While Dan gets set up, let me tell you a little about him. Dan is the archivist for the American Federation of Teachers at the Walter P. Reuther Library, located on Wayne State University's campus. He has been curating the AFT historical collection for over 20 years by preserving the records and making them available to the public. Dan also travels the country, helping AFT affiliates preserve their archives and advises on what to keep and what not to keep. Dan has done numerous oral histories to capture the union stories, has created numerous exhibits on labor history, co-produced various labor history videos, and is the host of the podcast Tales from the Reuther, which talks about with researchers who have come through the Reuther Library and published books, articles, or dissertations about labor and urban history. And with that, take it away, Dan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. I've read the book myself, so I'm familiar with what you've all read, and I really enjoy now talking about the lead up to this strike up in the UP. And I'm going to talk about these two strikes that not many people actually know about. And I just only knew a little bit about it, honestly. I knew they happened and I knew the consequences of what happened, but I didn't know the full details. So I'm really excited to share this information with you guys as well. But first, let's set up what era we were living in, what era we're gonna be talking about, and that is the Progressive Era. At the turn of the century, the country was booming. The capital was king, but Americans were starting to have enough of what the robber barons were doing during the Guild era, which was consolidating all wealth and power to themselves. Cities were filling up, industry was rising fast. Economically, we pushed past Europe for the first time. We were becoming a strong country. But at the same time, monopolies were creating this few rich and massive of poverty and disease, and not knowing what was going to come next. You basically woke up, worked, came home, ate, went to sleep, and that's it. Monopolies were basically controlling of this new industry as well. Jay Gould controlled the railroads, the entire railroad consortium. Rockefeller controlled oil that powered these trains. And Carnegie owned the steel mills. It was highly unregulated, without mercy, and these tycoons basically controlled the United States, what was going on, because we had a weaker government then. Occasionally, workers would rise up. They had enough of this. New ideas were coming across from Europe after 1848. There was many ideas of what this new thing called unions and collective bargaining, and you have a right of your own destiny to ask for higher wages. The biggest thing that ever happened in America at that time was 1877 with what some people call the first major general strike in the United States. It was basically a strike that started in Baltimore and spread across the country, shutting down the railroads. It was the first time that National Guard were called out not to defend the state, not to defend the country, but to defend the city and the property of industry against the workers. Remember, sometimes you go into a major city and there's the armory. There are armories over there and armories over there. Well, they were created not to defend, not to store arms in case there was an invasion from a foreign country, but for the National Guard to have arms ready and available to be able to put down worker uprisings. So you had this idea of going back even before the Guild, that capital versus unions were still going on. But now we came into the progressive era. People were sick and tired of this runaway industry, and they were looking at ways of bringing government into daily lives to regulate and to control. What they were seeing were pictures of children working in mines. What they saw were immigrants pouring into their cities, and cholera outbreaks were breaking out. So what they were doing was pushing for more social reforms, social injustice, bring human nature back into this industrial world. What they were basically calling for was temperance. They were calling for other things like that. Let me just go there. Progressive era. Here is a picture of the temperance movement, because what women were realizing is like men would go to work and the only release they had was to go to the bars and spend all the money on booze. Women were starting to think about the right to vote and how they were going to vote. And also it came across also more legislation on child labor issues. It came to an idea of the people as like, we can't continually have children working in the factories and working in the mines, and because it's inhumane. Children should be children. They should be going to this new thing called public education. Even though it was there already, it was growing fast. And the capitalists and the industry people were actually on board with this, because basically they said, yeah, what happens when a child loses an arm? They're not going to be able to work in the future when they're adults. Here in Michigan, though, we were also part of the progressive era. We still had major industry happening. Here's a picture of course, lumber. That was one of the biggest industries. Here's a picture of a typical factory that was being developed all across the state. We were popular with not only lumber, copper, but stoves were being built in Detroit, ships as well. Pharmaceuticals were big in Detroit. Agriculture was king. Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids were building up a big industry of agriculture all around. We were supplying the country with celery. Or actually, I just learned this today, that we were the celery capital for a while. All along with this, you still had immigrants pouring into the country, as well as in Michigan. Now, before, in the 1800s, the majority of the immigrants who were coming over into Michigan were basically Germans and British, but also you had a lot of French Canadians coming in. Then after the 1800s, Irish started appearing, Italians, Poles, Scandinavians started filling up Michigan at the beginning of the 1900s. And we will be talking about some of these groups in the next strike that I talk about. In 1911, Michigan is right in the middle of progressive era. Temperance is on the rise, legislation to curb child labor was happening in Michigan, but it was slow. The address to labor issues were slow. They wanted to protect women and children in the workforce, but not the men. They wanted to protect certain aspects of being injured on the job, but nothing about how long you had to work or how much wages you could have. There was no maximum minimum wage. You were not reimbursed if you got injured, if you lost a life or you lost a limb. There was no such thing as that at all. So when we come up to these strikes, these kind of issues do pop up. So what we'll see is we're going to talk about the Grand Rapids furniture strike first. I knew some bits about this, but not a lot. I didn't know that Grand Rapids in 1910 was the furniture capital of the country, with a population in Grand Rapids of 100,000 people. By 1910, there was almost like 47 factories that just made furniture, with over 8,500 employees who were putting out furniture all over the country. They represented 30% of all furniture that was made in the United States. So much power that they had that they were able to create kind of agencies within themselves in Grand Rapids to protect themselves. This is industry talking. What they did was they created a monopoly back in the 1890s or 1880s, somewhere in the late 1800s, sorry. But what they did was this monopoly was, not only did they control what was and who was working in the factories to make the furniture, but they were also on the boards of the banks. They were also on the boards of the lawyers who had boards. They were also part of the press. What they did was created a consortium to actually know what was going in and out of these factories and how the industry was going to be able to change market value. At the same time, studies were showing that those who were working in these factories were the lowest paid in the region, and compared to other jobs of the same thing. The group maintained such control that the workers who wanted to go somewhere else to get better pay were immediately blacklisted, or they were told if they go there, they would not be honored with that salary. They'd actually be hired at a lower salary. That's how much control and understanding that they had. Now, since they were also members of boards of the banks, this is an interesting fact too, about 47% of the population of Grand Rapids owned a house. That was very rare in the early 1900s. Most people just rented. And with that, the mortgages went to the banks. And who were on the boards of the banks? But the owners of the furniture factories. So it was a constant rat race for these employees. Who worked in them were the Dutch and the Polish. Majority were the Dutch who were working there. Opposite ends of religion, opposite ends of culture. Most of the Dutch were already established there and had higher paid skilled jobs there, while the Polish workers are mostly semi-skilled or unskilled. But they both went out together when they were forced to take a pay cut because the state law went from a 10-hour day to a 9-hour day. And that 9-hour day, well, you get your wages cut because you're only working 9 hours. And it's not the fault of the owner, as they would say, it's the fault of the state, so don't blame me. So they voted for strike. April 18th, 1911, the strike began with 6,000 to 7,000 who walked out with the support of the mayor and the support of the public, since the owners refused to even talk to the workers about this. They were members of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, but also there was 3 or 4 other unions because this is craft unions. These are divided within one industry. You have many crafts. And that's how they were organized back then, not by industry, but by craft. But they all got together and they all were setting aside cultural differences, language differences, and realizing this is something they had to do together. So they did walk out. The only difference between the two is the Dutch wanted to have more a refined way of protesting and picketing and keeping in the line of the law. The Polish workers, meanwhile, were looking at this as like they recognize these things are happening in Europe. They left, they saw what happened in 1848. They noticed these things are happening in Europe. And here it is again happening in 1911. And they understood what it meant to actually bring about change. And they took more militant action. Their militant action actually started on May 15th because slowly you had workers moving back into the factories. Economically, they were like not be able to afford the rent, the mortgage, food on the table. Also, the owners brought in scabs from Chicago. And so a big occurrence happened on May 15th. It was a kind of a riot. You can call it a disturbance, but when you had the owner actually drive up to the factory and take some of those who are working inside the factory out and faced with 1,200 people facing the factory and looking at them and going, why are you doing this? Well, people were hungry, they were scared, they were upset. Yeah, things got out of hand, but who were on the front lines? Now, this is the interesting thing too. Majority of who work in the furniture factories were men, white men. Those who were on the outside were the women and children. But at this particular moment in the front lines were women and children either holding their babies and holding their children and basically saying, enough is enough. Well, things got out of hand, 3 people arrested, things were thrown, but it was enough to cause confrontation with some of the factories, furniture factories. 2 or 3 actually gave in to the demands of the strikers and gave them their pay at 9 hours. But it wasn't the majority enough. Trouble was, more and more people started going into the factories. Then what happened was there's 2 things that happened simultaneously. One was the Dutch Reformed Church, especially the Fontaine Street Church, fearing of losing donations from the wealthy who attended that church, condemned the strike. Finally, the Christian Reformed Church stated that no member of the church can belong to a union because the primary purpose of the union was a material gain and not the glorification of God. Therefore, they cannot join a union, be part of a union. Now, it didn't say all were against the union. A Reverend Groen, I cannot pronounce his name, he was actually favored unions, and he was a part of the Christian Reformed Church. He was on the liberal side. However, the majority said you cannot be part of it. Also, what's happening, as I mentioned, economics was happening. And when you were working a job or you're barely making ends meet, the economy for you inside your family starts to falter. The same time what's happening around the country as it happened in Grand Rapids was a socialist movement was coming up. People were not afraid to say that I am a socialist and I'm running for mayor. There were more mayors, more people on school boards, more people in city councils who were elected as socialists within that time period between 1900 and 1915. They never saw these numbers before. You had Eugene V. Debs running for president. He ran 4 times, lost, but each time he gained more and more votes. The highest I think he got was something like equivalent to about 6%, 7% of the popular vote. That's pretty large for a 4th party or a 3rd party person, especially in 1912, when you had 4 people running in different opposite sides of the spectrum running for president. So you had people like were being cautious. It's like even the American Federation of Labor was saying, be cautious because we have some socialist people coming in who might stir up trouble. You also had some people who showed up from the industrial workers of the world. Now, you will find out more about the industrial workers of the world soon, hopefully, but they were founded in 1905 by many people who were on the far left, including a large union called the Western Miners Federation, and Mother Jones was at the founding of the IWW. But they were showing up as well. So people were starting to get a little antsy here. We don't need a socialist kind of like takeover here. Nevertheless, the workers did have a meeting and a vote to 3-1 voted to go back. Because one, the Dutch were realizing that if their church is saying so, then it must be true. Economics were hitting harder and harder, and finally it just fizzled out. But there was one other thing that happened in Grand Rapids immediately afterwards. I'm talking about the politics of it. The mayor was very pro-working class. He knew the ward system where he was elected got in there because of the working class. Now, in a book called Strike, was talking about how the elite of Grand Rapids changed the ward system into 3, giving consolidated power to the east side of the city and leaving the west side with only 1 ward. It's still in existence today. They changed the dynamics of democracy because what they saw was that workers were getting a little bit too more antsy, thinking about the socialist ideal, and they wanted more consolidation of power for themselves. It's still in existence for Grand Rapids today. Now we move on to Kalamazoo. Please let me know if I'm running over time. Someone just ding me. Sorry, I'm just kind of rambling on here. Kalamazoo. You had different from Grand Rapids because in Kalamazoo it was the corset factories, one for corset factory, but it was the largest one because it changed the ideas of how a corset should be worn. Before you used whalebone in corsets, but this guy came up with the idea of using turkey bone, which is more elastic. Doesn't smell in the summer as well, and won't break and make those awful noises when you're walking around. All of a sudden, you're a big snap. They won't do that. It revolutionized. They became very big. They became very powerful. Now, difference between Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo, it was a majority of women working in Kalamazoo, and whereas in Grand Rapids it was a majority white men. Now, as of today, you're trying to start a union, very hard. Look at Amazon. It's almost impossible. They just broke through with 1. Working conditions and wages, I can go on. The list is so long with that one. I can't even stop. Sexual harassment was very prevalent within this factory. And that went on today with McDonald's when they went out on a 1-day strike back in 2018. And many things now, I'm not saying that the only sexual harassment was happening in this factory. It happened in pretty much every single factory that happened with women working. It was a cause that brought people together at times if they handled it correctly. Many things were happening in these periods too across the country. You had the uprising of 20,000 in New York City in 1909. 20,000 women from the textile Lower East Side walked down the streets of Manhattan demanding a pay raise. In March 1911, the shirtwaist factory fire, which killed 146 women and children because the doors were locked. We will hear more about doors that are locked soon as well. But what happened there, that tragedy changed the laws of how factories are built and where fire safety is going on. Lawrence textile strike was just happened, and that was led by the IWW. 50,000 people in the textile town up in Lawrence, Massachusetts walked out. You had, I think the last I read was 20 different languages, majority women went on strike against the textile owners. Majority women again. So here in Kalamazoo, they're looking at this. There are strikes all across the country of women leading it. So why shouldn't we? Why can't we do the same thing? So in 1911, 10-hour workday, 6 days a week, you're doing piecework. Pieces of work, it's like you make the cloth, you make the collar, you do this, you just do a little piecework, and that's how you get paid. At the same time, you had to pay for the thread. Sometimes you had to pay for the equipment. Sometimes you had to pay for the cloth that you had, not at wholesale, but for over-the-counter sale, not the wholesale that they were buying for. This is where the issues of sexual harassment come up, because the foreman would say, you don't have to pay that extra for the thread if, and I leave it at that. You can get a better job if you do this for me. Sexual happenings were rampant within this factory, and enough so where they actually brought it up that first time in 1911. They walked out, formed a union with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, Local 82, and blamed it all on a foreman because they cut wages, they cut hours, and they increased hours, I'm sorry. The 1,000 walked out, and they honored that for that time period. It wasn't a contract. They didn't recognize the union, but they honored it at that point. They didn't do anything with the sexual harassment. It's just what men do, right? This is 1911. But the local kept growing because the issues were going higher and higher. Not only were they forced to endure this sexual harassment, but they had to share the washrooms with the men. And the quote that they were unsavory, loathsome sores on the men that they had to share the cloths with to wash themselves down with became unsavory and unsanitary. Finally, the next year, it came up again. The union decided to come up and say, we have other demands. We want to end this. We want to look into this, want the foreman to stop touching the girls. We want separate washrooms. And of course, we want better wages to match what we do. We want to actually get maximum wage if we could have it. The owner said no. Now, these girls were with grit, though. They were so impressed. They were young and energetic, and so impressed with the AFL at the time and the International Light Garment Workers. One time, they even mentioned that, wow, these women would show up in their roller skates to drop off their union dues. So much that there was like, there's energy here. Well, when the management refused to honor this agreement and went back on their word, well, the girls went out. The ladies went out. The women went out. They couldn't deal with having this happen again. And what happened when they went out was because when they had members go up and actually ask for something, 11 people were fired right on the spot because they asked. They stuck their necks out. They asked what was going on. So the IGLWU sent an organizer, Josephine Casey, who was amazed by what the energy of these women. And finally they said, she said, since we're getting injunctions, I have 5 more minutes left. Okay, I will hurry up. She saw that injunctions were happening. They couldn't picket, so they held prayer vigils in front. They weren't moving back and forth. They weren't doing certain things that usually you see on a picket line. They were actually picketing across the street. It's not in violation of the injunction. Later behold, many of them were arrested just because they found other ways. It was eventually about time to happen. What happened with the strike, I'm going to wrap it up real quick. Things did backfire because then they probably introduced the sexual harassment later. Now, most of the middle-class women were like not supporting it, but some were. This was the final straw. Why did you mention it before? If this was happening and you did it in a dignified way, of course, we would then honor you and listen to you and we'll be there with you, but they didn't. Middle-class women were also ready to fight for suffrage. Did they want to put their necks out for these women that were working in the factories or get the women's votes? And the third thing, the press and the owners said, you're just making up things now. You should have said at the beginning, we don't believe you. The strike eventually collapses. They don't get honored with anything. They said, actually, we will do what you wanted to do at the beginning and give us a little bit of raise, but the company said too little, too late, we are done. And what happened though, was since they went back on their word, there was a consumer boycott, and eventually the corset company, fashions changed and the corset company closed. Wrapping it up very quickly, oops. The battles might be lost, but they're never forgotten. And the lessons learned for future social justice always is a long thread. If you thought the Montgomery bus boycott happened spontaneous, it was in the works for 10 or 15 years before that. I bring up these 2 pictures because this is the memory we have now for these 2 strikes. One is actual physical memory that you can actually look at in Grand Rapids. The other is a poster project that people made for the Kalamazoo corset strike. And one day I hope there is a memorial or something of physical structure that you can go and see them. Now, you might think it's like, well, these unions failed, these battles were lost, but it wasn't. It was a buildup of the Industrial Revolution that was going to happen within the unions within not a short period of time, within about 20 15, 20 years. But the sexual harassment strike, that did not happen until a good century later. And it's still going on. McDonald's, you still have walkouts, and you still have consternation for that. It's something I always like to say is like, yes, people say history repeats itself, but I also like to say history does not repeat itself too much, but it often rhymes. Sorry I went over there for every folks, but this is a great introduction for the next talk, which will be about the copper strike. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Actually, I've actually seen that labor monument in Grand Rapids, and the stones are really cool because you can see the different unions that donated to help build the statue, and I thought that was pretty I thought that was pretty
That's
cool.
That's neat.
Yeah, it's a beautiful statue. It's very poignant. It's like a nice dip down and how the water raises up. It's a really cool monument. Well, while Lindsay pulls up her slides, take a few minutes to tell you more about her. Lindsay Hiltunen is the university archivist at Michigan Tech University in Houghton, Michigan. She's also a PhD student in the Rhetoric, Theory, and Culture program at Tech. Her research interests involve intersections of archives, rhetorical production and history, and social memory, particularly around instances of labor upheaval, social conflict, and contested public space. She has been working in libraries since 2005, starting her career with the District of Columbia Public Library, and has been an archivist at Michigan Tech since 2014. She's the current past chair of the oral history section of the Society of American Archivists and is the current president of the Michigan Archival Association. She lives in Keweenaw Bay in Michigan's Upper Peninsula with her spouse Thomas, two Weimaraners, Frankenstein and Otto, and her Siamese cat, Little Nero. And with that, Lindsay, take it away.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself for a second there. Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to be a part of this panel this evening. So Take a Trip with Me in 1913, it harkens back to Woody Guthrie's song pertaining to the copper strike. And we'll get into that a little later when we talk about the aftermath and the memory. But we'll dive in just a little bit where I work at Michigan Tech. I oversee the department of our university archives and the Copper Country historical collections. So we're about 20% university and institutional history and about 80% broader Copper Country and Western Upper Peninsula history. Our patron base is across the globe, but we do, for those international researchers we get, typically has to do with the migration patterns coming from Europe, people doing genealogy or different types of academic research related to industrial heritage or the development around industrial cores. We do a lot of different types of programming and services at Michigan Tech, including a robust research and reference program. We have two other archivists on staff, as well as an archives assistant that do the bulk of our reference and research. We also do instruction, outreach in the community, and with collaborative local programming. We've done some oral history programs, but our premier collections relate to corporate records pertaining to the hard rock mining industry. So the copper mining that was taking place in this part of Michigan. Records related to the strike, labor, and the corporations, the copper firms. We have three premier collections for Calumet and Hecla, the Quincy Mining Company, and also the Copper Range Company. While we don't have a lot of manuscript collections that are from the voice of labor, we do have records related to labor in state records collections, in those corporate collections, clippings, files, photographs that we've assembled from a broad range of photographers, individual and corporate photographers, biographical files, all kinds of good stuff. I would say our premier collections are those corporate records collections, but you can find snippets of labor within those larger corporate records. And then you have to get creative. We do have some scrapbooks from later strikes that took place in the mid-20th century. There's inquest documents, different photographs, like I mentioned. So it's definitely like we're a gateway, but we'll let the researcher kind of figure out what path they want to go down as they're exploring our collections. But diving into the strike, so the strike itself took place, it started on July 23rd in 1913. It was a district-wide strike that pitted workers against the major copper companies. It lasted 9 months between the Western Federation of Miners and the copper country, the powerful copper companies. It's something that we talk about in terms of state history, trying to put it into context there for this panel, but it definitely had national impact. The strike was communicated broadly in the press, not just in papers of record for the copper country, but across the state, and it was picked up on the wire and distributed across the country in major metropolitan and some suburban and rural newspapers. So it was definitely situated in a moment where a lot of things were happening in terms of labor across the United States. And the strike definitely was situated in a place that got a lot of spotlight because there was a lot of interest in terms of these bubblings up of upheaval and people fighting for justice, for wages, safer working conditions, and things like that. But before we dive into the actual details of the strike, I think it's really important, sort of what Dan was talking about, like placing these labor movements in this broader umbrella of the progressive era. So in the early 1900s, Americans were really trying to improve economic and social life. Progressive politicians and folks in the citizenry that believed in the progressive movement, championed the curtailing of corporate power. They were trying to get labor laws enacted for children, like setting age limits on when it was appropriate for children to work in certain types of positions, safety protocols, working conditions, anything that you could think of that would be a basic improvement for how one lives and works, particularly around dangerous manufacturing, mining, and other sorts of industrial and difficult jobs. Relating to like heavy equipment and things like that. Michigan had a progressive governor at the time of the 1913 strike, Woodridge Ferris. He ran on that platform. He did advocate for incremental improvements in social reform, but he was against revolutionary change. So there were some advocates in the rank and file of various unions and also within different social dynamics where people were fighting for faster change, like wanting to have like a quick overthrow of some of this corporate power. But I think, Ferris was trying to straddle this tightrope of, being able to have an inroad to discussing things with corporate power, mining managers, for instance, in the sake of the copper mines, but also wanted to, still be in favor of those that were fighting for these changes. So figuring out a way that you could have evolutionary change rather than strictly trying to fight and do a revolutionary overhaul of the system. So he was able to maintain goodwill with James McNaughton, who was the general manager for C&H, but he was also popular among those who believed in progressive era reform. In terms of dialing back even further and looking beyond our state and looking at labor in the early 20th century in the United States more generally, progressives were championing, as I said, for reform in business, and unions were bubbling up to organize for improvements. Mine workers formed industrial unions such as the United Mine Workers of America, the IWW, which Dan mentioned, and the WFM. The first 2 decades of the 20th century, there were strikes happening all across, particularly in places that had, heavy manufacturing or hard rock extraction and mineral industries. Lockouts and violence were common ways that people were trying to influence how workers and management interacted, and those could sometimes get extremely violent to the point of fatal instances taking place. And the copper country was no exception. Michigan copper mining companies, they saw increased competition from mines out in Montana and Arizona, but mine managers, with their eyes continually looking for revenue and profit, they were looking for ways to reduce expenses. So there's this sort of tension from the get-go when you look at the desires and sort of the being in the world of labor and like what they're trying to do to improve their situation versus what corporations and industry is trying to do, always trying to find ways to improve profits for shareholders and being able to expand their businesses. Copper mining managers became suspicious when labor unions were coming into the copper country, often viewing them as outside agitators that would demand higher wages, which was a counter narrative to their their hope to increase profits. It's also important to look beyond just this idea of the progressive moment, but also think about how space and landscape impacts any type of social conflict or upheaval. So looking at space and place in the Copper Country, thinking generally just about our climate up here, we have very long and arduous winters. Sometimes the snow falls as early as late September, not sticking or not a lot of snow, but just to give you a sense of, it gets cold early. There's threats of snow. I remember October's going trick-or-treating with my snow pants underneath my costume because you had to stay warm. And so just imagining that 100+ years ago, where lifestyles were different, housing was different, access to clothing and the types of clothing that people had access to, very different. So just how people lived and worked in their community and in this space. By 1900, after more than 50 years of copper production in the Kuna's landscape, it was a testimony to the power, progress, and prestige of the area mines. So if you glance at this slide here, you can see some larger homes in the upper area. And then if you look over to the right, you can see some smaller homes, more densely packed close to each other, uniform in style. So you can get a sense of, maybe where some of the mine managers were living versus where some of the workers in the boarding houses were. And then obviously there's church steeples that dotted the landscape. So there's this really rich dynamic view of what we're seeing in the community in terms of towering shaft houses, immense smokestacks, magnificent church steeples, these lofty structures contrasted with these meager and smaller and more densely packed boarding homes. And this is where you could see some of the social tension coming into play as well, not just within the working world, but also visually on the landscape in the community. You can see sort of this us and them, bosses versus workers, and how people lived and worked just in the community itself. So who were these people that were working in the copper mines? Mostly it was an immigrant workforce. The Copper Country was an incredible mix of people. I've listed a few on the slides, but it's by no means exhaustive in terms of the ethnic makeup of the community in the early 1900s. Boarding houses, many operated by wives of mine workers, contained dense concentrations of men from the same country. It was a way to build brotherhood, fraternity, solidarity amongst your ethnic identity. You take this trip across the ocean and you come to this foreign land. So being around those that spoke your language, understood your cultural traditions, it was a way to feel home away from home. And it was also a way to build morale, working these difficult jobs that you had folks to go home to that you could break bread with after work. So it wasn't by accident that folks were living together in communities and neighborhoods or streets around different ethnic makeups. And it's also no surprise that one of the union's biggest challenges was figuring out ways to overcome language barriers in terms of organizing folks behind the rally cause for labor. There's evidence within the Michigan Tech archives of different newspapers in foreign languages, and there would be ads that would be taken out talking about where to meet to discuss things related to the strike, or there would be posters printed in multiple languages to get people to rally behind the strike cause. So just thinking about the rich mix of people and different intentions for why they're going to the strike, but then also just the very aspect of how do we communicate and how do we communicate meaningfully behind this cause. It adds more challenge to the mix when you're already confronting this big challenge of attempting to stand up to the corporate power. So talking a little bit about, so we talked about the landscape, but also I think it's important to talk about paternalism, which is sort of a term for how the community was organized at the sort of setup of the corporate powers. So mining companies, they provided amenities for the community, which was wonderful. They built libraries, bathhouses, and they did provide houses for workers, usually at reasonable rates. And it was intended to retain and attract workers to stay working for the mine. So benefits were intended to reward good work, instill loyalty, and quell complaints. But sometimes paternalism was a double-edged sword, because while they're building these amenities, there's also this sort of unspoken bond that if you're going to partake in these amenities, you're going to be in alignment with anything that the corporation decides. So if they're going to instill new technology that might be dangerous, or if there's a wage cut because they decide that they want to pad their bottom line for shareholders, whatever the instance might be, there's sort of this unwritten rule, like if you're going to participate in this paternal system, it's a quid pro quo, like we'll build you this library that your children can go and attend, or bathhouses for people to enjoy and get clean, but you have to toe the line when it comes to work. So there's this tension, like how do you make decisions for what's best for you as a person, what's best for your family versus what's best for the company, what's best for the community. Paternalism in the copper country, it did indeed create a pecking order in terms of workplace and the community. Skilled workers with mining experience, particularly those from Cornwall and Germany and other mining industry or mining areas in Europe, they often received better jobs because they were coming in with some skill, either knowing how to operate certain equipment or knowing certain safety rules for how to work, like in a stope, for instance. But they also could see those differences with some of the unskilled workers. So those that came from Finland, Italy, Eastern Europe, they often lived in more congested housing. They were given some of the more dangerous and laborious type jobs, and they weren't often given the same respect, pay, or recognition within the structure of the mine. So getting to the strike, really what fueled it was the grievances. So this picture here shows a mine fire that took place at one of the Osceola shafts in the late 1800s. I believe it was 1896. And over 30 people perished in that fire. And I think I like to use this image because despite the fact that the fire is live, it's in motion, like there's smoke visibly coming up, the buildings, like the hoist house that's pictured there is on the threat of collapse. And they decided to document that moment and almost like pose this picture of people, because there's some looking back to the debauchery of this fire, but then there's people actually looking directly into the lens of the camera, like almost as if they're posed in front of this. And to me, like it just speaks volumes about how dangerous this was, and sometimes how out of control workers felt. That you're here watching and knowing that your colleagues, your friends, your brother is dying in this mine, but here, pose for this picture. I think it kind of shows some of the awkward dynamics that people had to deal with just trying to put food on the table. There's no mistake about it. Mine work was dangerous, dirty, and deadly. In 1911, 63 men, according to records, died in copper country mines, and many more were severely injured. As early as 1906, the WFM tried to come into the copper country to start up early discussions to rally up the rank and file, to get some, boots on the ground for people that would be interested to address working conditions and improving things for mine workers. But nothing really took firm until the summer of 1913. This changed as mining companies began to introduce a one-man drill. I think that's sort of the impetus why the 1913 strike came to be, because companies were trying to introduce this new design. It increased production and also profit because it reduced the number of workers needed at each drilling site. Typically, the drills used prior to the one-man drill concept, it was a team drill. So there would be someone actually operating the drill, and then there was a scout or a co-worker with you, either helping to operate the equipment or at least being a safety scout to be a part of that process. So the one-man drill, the concept of that stripped it away to one person. So it would change the dynamic and the amount of laborers, and it would also change the level of safety or the level of implied safety. Skilled drill operators reacted very negatively to this proposed change, fearing that people would lose their lives or there'd be an increase in accident reports and people actually getting injured, and not just fatalities, but serious critical injuries. So because people didn't want to work alone in these dangerous jobs. So I think these are some of the initial bubblings up. And things are getting more organized. So by July, there was enough of a rally cry that many of the mine workers that were jumping in with WFM leadership, they were organized enough at this point that they could compose letters that they sent out to all the mine management across the copper country, asking for settling of grievances, letting them know that there are issues with safety, there are issues with hours, there are issues with working conditions. And they deployed these letters, which the mine managers in turn ignored. So on July 23rd, 1913, the underground mine workers went on strike. They walked out. Governor Ferris called in the National Guard shortly thereafter to quote unquote protect life and property. And strikers held huge rallies and parades, which sometimes turned hostile. Several shooting incidents resulted in the death of strikers and others who chose to return to work. There's a few incidents that I don't have time to jump into tonight, but you can look it up and I'd be happy to help anyone afterwards. But there were some serious fatal injuries that took place in the early days or the early months, especially of the strike. The copper country was certainly in the midst of a great upheaval, and really all they were trying to do was to get mine management to come to the bargaining table, which they just continued to ignore those pleas. I do want to mention, since this is around the Great Michigan Read, that it wasn't just men. So mostly men were working in the mines and they were the ones that physically walked out, but those that were creating this visual image of the strike, those that were walking and creating picket lines and supporting those, women were out there. Women and even children marched and participated in subversive tactics to dissuade strikebreakers and champion the cause. There's instances of broomsticks and mops being dipped into privy buckets and being thrust at people, trying to dissuade them from breaking the strike line and to force them not to go in. Just as basic as picking up a rock and throwing it. I mean, just anything that you could think of to try to get someone that maybe, okay, they're marginally and a little bit mildly violent. Like at this stage, if you're, thrusting a broom, like a nasty broom, or throwing a rock, I mean, this is pretty heavy stuff, but it does get it does get a lot worse. But I do want to mention Big Annie because she comes up so many times when you think about the strike of 1913, and it's almost that she's taken on this transcendent quality that, she's not just a woman that was actually just there and championing the cause. She's actually taken on this iconic status, this transcendent status, almost as if she's an angel or something, because she's just so recognizable. And there's so many pictures of her, such as the one on this slide, draped in the flag or carrying a flag and showing off her impressive stature. But she was born to Slovenian immigrants in 1888, and she was instrumental for the cause. She did serve as president of the Women's Auxiliary number 15. She marched, she was an ally, she created events, she helped create posters, she held lunches. She did serve some jail time for some of her more mildly violent and subversive tactics, but she was a true believer in the cause for Michigan labor in the copper country. And she was in turn later on, many decades later, after she passed, she was inducted in the Labor's International Hall of Fame and the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. So as you know, or as many of you probably know about Italian Hall, it took place on Christmas Eve, 1913. So the Women's Auxiliary for the WFM was hosting a Christmas party for striking workers and their families, particularly with the children in mind, just trying to bring some cheer to a really somber time and place. Even just the simple fixtures that we would take for granted today were it was pure delight and joy. There was Christmas music, there was fruit, and especially oranges, which were really hard to come by, candy. I mean, just thinking about people being out on strike, scraping by, trying to get basic necessities and food on the table. The fact that they organized this party was meant to boost morale, but also just bring some joy to the families in terms of having something festive to look forward to, something to just truly bond as a family and as a community. Unfortunately, it turned dark. The party was held on the second floor, and as someone reportedly yelled fire into the big crowd, there was no fire. People streamed down the stairs. People were tripping, bodies were piling on top of each other, and the crush within that stairwell caused the death of 73 people. Almost 60 of them were children. The event became national news, and it definitely polarized the community even further. In the immediate aftermath, like the hours, the minutes, the days after this event, the confusion across the community was rampant in terms of how many people died. Was there a claim of fire? Was that really what happened? And why were the doors blocked at the bottom of the stairs so that people couldn't get out? Was it the fact that someone was holding the doors closed? Was it just that the crush of bodies, the doors weren't allowed to close? And the debate about whether the doors opened a certain way kind of caused the imagination around how this happened and the intentionality behind it. And I will warn you that the next couple of photos might be a little sensitive, so because they do show the makeshift morgue and things like that. So if you don't want to pay attention, maybe just look away for a few minutes because they are pretty hard to see. So this is the interior of the hall after the strike. You can definitely get a sense of a mad rush for people to exit. Chairs are toppled over. There's food and different party supplies that are strewn across the floor. The Christmas tree up on the stage is a really bitter reminder of what that party was supposed to be, and the chairs crushed and toppled over on the floor reminds us what really happened. And this next image is pretty graphic, but makeshift morgues had to be set up. And they were putting bodies into wagons and taking them. And this one, I've seen this image hundreds, if not thousands of times in my career as a historian and a local of this area. And it still chokes me up to this day. These children look like they're fresh out of a bath, sleeping. And in fact, these are some of the ones that lost their lives in that event. And I can hardly preciously imagine how that impacted those families. So this is from one of the joint funerals that was taking place. And then this is a funeral procession out to Forest Hill Cemetery, or sorry, not Forest Hill, to Lakeview Cemetery in Calumet, which is several miles outside of the city center. So if you can imagine, walking out in bitter cold temperatures, many inches of snow, several miles, carrying dozens of coffins. And here's one of the mass graves. So after that, the strike took on a darker character. The Citizens Alliance forcibly removed Charles Moyer, who was the WFM president. There's different accounts about how violent he was forced out of town, how violently he was forced. So it really depends on how you read the record and what sources you choose to believe. But I'll let you be the historian if you're interested to look into that. But he was put on a train to Chicago. The union did get a congressional investigation into conditions in the Copper Country, but by then the strike was all but broken. The companies did end up implementing the one-man drill. Some concessions by the companies were later given in terms of working conditions, wages, and in some instances, safety protocols. But historians are tending to argue that these were inevitable progressive reforms anyway that would have happened whether the strike took place or not. And by 1916, so a couple of years after the strike in Copper Country ended, the WFM was trying to distance themselves, like they were all but broke, like financially broke from this, but also just from a PR standpoint, they wanted to sort of regroup and reboot. So they renamed themselves the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers in 1916. So the long memory of the strike, I have a couple more slides I'll try to breeze through so we can get to Bob, but it really casts a shadow on the Copper Country, not just in the immediate aftermath, but I'm all the way to this day. Like if I were to go into a restaurant or a pub in Calumet and I were to exclaim, the Italian hall doors opened X way, the record player would stop, the jukebox would stop, and people would turn around and they would either clap for me or they would want to chase me down in the street. People over 100 years later still hold on so strongly to their belief about what truly happened, what the impact of those happenings were, and the meaning of that. So how do we remember? And through this, acts of public memory take place in a multitude of ways, through memoirs, songs, films, memorial sites and practices, archival records like those myself and my colleagues keep, other things such as preservation and commemoration of artifacts within families. Like there's a lot of ways that the strike is keeping its long memory, and we're trying to do so as individuals, as practitioners of history, and as community members. So in the immediate few days after the strike, the biggest way that you could visually see the impact was through the periodicals and the serial publications in the community, local pamphlets and the papers of record. And it was a pretty hard line what people were believing, depending on what paper you read. So the Daily Mining Gazette, for instance, they had a headline that stated 80 perish in Christmas Eve tragedy at Calumet, right next to an article that accused President Moyer of capitalizing on the tragedy. So it was pretty clear what the editorial staff at the Daily Mining Gazette felt about what happened in the strike. It was labor's fault that this happened. They're just doing this because they want to make money. They don't care about the lives that were lost. And some might even argue to the point that, it was a hoax perpetuated, by labor. Alternatively, one of the local Finnish papers of record had a headline that read 83 murdered, related to Italian Hall. And they posted this picture with the Citizens Alliance on the Grim Reaper's scythe. So I think they're not pulling any punches either in terms of what they believe, who's at fault. After they actually published this cartoon and that headline, their editorial staff, they were actually quickly arrested for coming out with such a hard stance. So some with power in the community did not necessarily want folks to read that, and they were trying to sort of hush journalists for giving their interpretation of local events. Another instance of memory takes place quite a few decades later, after the strike even took place, but Woody Guthrie's song 1913 Massacre. So there was sort of this social amnesia after 1914 that people in the community, they didn't want to talk about the strike. They wanted to get it behind them, move on, honor the dead, but life is for the living sort of a thing, and just move on as if nothing had happened. But folks that were sympathetic to labor across the country, they wanted the strike to be known. Ella Reeve Bloor, also known as Mother Bloor, wrote in her autobiography, We Are Many, about her time at the strike. There's some good images of her actually marching in Calumet and various places in support of the strike in Copper Country. And Woody Guthrie, he was inspired by that. So he wrote a song taking a very pro-labor stance, as was his wont with his style and his sympathies for politics, always being a champion of labor. So it's no surprise that he would write such a song. But as an artist, as a singer, he took creative license with some of the language that he carefully chose to use. If you've ever looked at the lyrics of that song, he chooses some pretty strong terms in how certain instances are discussed, I guess say. So he writes the lyrics, sings the songs, but then the impact that language has on how we interpret that event, especially if that's our first instance to how we sort of think about the strike, you come in with this preconceived notion if you're kind of going along with what Woody said. So he's trying to shape a perspective based on his belief, but he's not necessarily always taking things from the record or from some sort of a historical interpretation. You could argue there's some emotional element of what he's trying to talk about in terms of a larger labor cause, but maybe losing some of the details of things that actually happened in Calumet. And that can be argued and debated, but I think it's worth noting that, it is an interpretive dance that one does when they're writing a song. So how much do we put in that bucket of belief for the words he chose. I think that's up to the listener. And then we get to, of course, the doors. So you can't help but hear or think about the doors of Italian Hall. Did they open inward? Did they open outward? So the building itself was actually raised in 1984. They cited a crack in the facade and noted a lack of funding to fix it. It was going to take over $500,000 to restore the building. Image evidence from the early 1980s suggests that maybe it wasn't necessarily needing that much repair. I'm not an architect, but there's pictures that I've seen that I wonder, was the structural damage really that intense? But then the building's gone, so the debate about the doors became more hotly contested. Like, did the doors open outward and people were physically holding them shut, or did they open inward and people couldn't physically open them because of the crush of bodies behind them? And that debate continues depending on, you know, your interpretation of the evidence. So this actual image comes from research that folks did. There's some historians and archivists at the Kuna National Historical Park, other consulting historians that were familiar with the strike, the building, and knew how to interpret historical records and architectural prints and things like that. And this is their case about how the doors open. So the front double doors opened outwardly, but the doors that were actually blocked was a folding double door. That's their argument. And I tend not to make claims about which way the door opened. I like people to decide for themselves and do their own critical thinking. But it's interesting, depending on what your firm belief is and what physical evidence is presented for you, like how that shapes it or it affirms your belief, you know, depending. So it's definitely something that's interesting to talk about. And then the last instance of memory I'll mention briefly, because this could be a presentation in of itself, is the Italian Hall Memorial Park in Calumet. So at the site where the building was, they did save the sandstone archway, and it now sits in Calumet on that site where the building was as a memorial. So there's some plaques that were donated by the UP Labor Council, the AFL-CIO of Michigan, some of the other local, I think, chambers of commerce and things like that, that, you know, talk a little bit about just remembering the strike. But this site has changed in its iteration. So since it formulated several decades ago, there's been different interpretive signage there. There's been a few different narrative signs from the Michigan Historic Site Program that have had very markedly different language. So if you saw that site in 2001 versus going to look at it today, the interpretive signage there is very different. So that's going to shape how you're introduced to this event. So I think it's very important to think about the language that we use to discuss history. And if we're going to be putting something at a public space, how that language influences the way that we come to think about and either believe or disbelieve what is said about a particular event, space, or place. And that signage continues to change again, because even before, you can kind of see underneath the text that there's the black granite stone with the names of the victims on it. And that was recently installed within the last few years. But before that, there was no mention of the names of any of the people that perished at Italian Hall. And that begs the question, how can you remember somebody if you can't even name them? So I think it's really important to think about the power of a name and what naming means in terms of politics, in terms of memory, in terms of even community. Like, if we're not even naming these people, like, how can we truly remember them? And with that, I'll close with this concept of memory. I always like to share this one because it wasn't all children that perished in Italian Hall. Some were adults. And this is a picture of Betty and Abram Niemela. They actually were two that perished in Italian Hall, and they did leave an orphan of their little 4-month-old. And to me, I think this is a good way to close, because the one thing that we can never do is we can never forget. And as we interpret this long memory, we need to do our due diligence to question the records, question what we think we know, but always remember the people that were impacted by this, not just ourselves, but the direct impact of the people that perished and those they left behind. Thank you so much. And I think with that, we'll pass it off to Bob.
All right, thank you, Lindsay.
Bob, do you want me to read your bio first?
Oh, I guess we should probably do that. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll tell them a little bit about you before you dive on in. Anyway, as you say, Bob has been an archivist at the Archives of Michigan since 2000. His primary duties include arranging and describing manuscript materials and state government records of all formats, including paper and digital. He also performs reference work, creates social media content, and serves as an editor and writer of Trace and Archives of Michigan serial publication. His favorite research topics include Michigan in the Prohibition era and the Lansing labor holiday of 1937. He actually lives in Jackson with his lovely wife and two adorable cats, Cora and Greta. And now that I've introduced you, off you go.
Okay. I will do my best to be fairly brief. I'm going to go ahead a little bit, but I think, what happened here? I'm going to jump ahead in time, but I think you're also going to see some themes that are in common with what Dan and Lindsay have already talked about. And I'm calling this sort of like a golden age, labor during the New Deal in the sense, well, I'll get into that. But basically, this was a time, I think, when labor and unions enjoyed a popular support that they maybe in many ways didn't have before. And yet, as we'll see in the other two eyes, there's often a political swing of the pendulum going the other way. I'll start with the New Deal, with the Great Depression. As we all know, many people out of work. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, promising a New Deal. And as Dan was talking about, with a lot of progressive reforms in the early 1900s, you see that, I believe, around 1932 too, brought on by economic conditions. In the case of unionization, there were working conditions that worsened. Companies began cutting costs, but yet they were demanding more production from workers. So suddenly, some workers that may have been more opposed to joining the unions, that we may have been more complaining about communism or what have, there was always an undercurrent of people who would charge that unions were a breed of communist activity. But now you see more average people, they're starting to become much more accepted. And in fact, in 1933, when Roosevelt took office, the Congress passed the National Industrial Recovery Act. Now that act was about it had a broader scope than just unions. It was also, it also addressed competition between industries, price controls, wages, such like that. But there was a section including the right of labor to organize and bargain collectively. Now what I have there on the right is the Blue Eagle that was associated with that act. Businesses that supported it were encouraged to put that poster in their window. Now, while the NIRA sounds great, unfortunately, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 1935. And FDR had a problem with the Supreme Court declaring much of his reforms, the reforms of his administration, unconstitutional. He complained about that. His solution was what became known as court packing. He wanted to expand the amount of justices so that he could handpick while he was president, handpick some more and of course give it a liberal majority. Even some Democrats balked at that. And that didn't go over so well for him, but I'm going to say put a pin in that because I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Now, with the Supreme Court striking down the NIRA, that in 1935, that was 1935 when the Supreme Court did that. That same year saw the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, aka the Wagner Act. And this is Senator Wagner right here, looking very happy. Specifically, his name was Robert Wagner. He was a senator from New York. He was the sponsor of the legislation. And this took the union part of the NIRA and made that into law. So once again, collective bargaining was guaranteed for all workers across the country. So by 1935, you start to see, again, unions becoming even more popular, enjoying more popular support. Some other events that happened in 1935 that are significant. The founding of the Congress of Industrial Organizations and the United Auto Workers. The CIO began as a committee within the American Federation of Labor. and soon went out on its own. But the CIO was more broad in the membership that it picked than the AFL was. They were willing to, they were open to unskilled workers, not just skilled workers, for example, and they were more open to recruiting minorities than the AFL was. So that's why the CIO membership grew. According to one statistic I saw, by 1937, they claimed to have had 4 million members across the country. Just a couple notes about these two images I picked. On the left here is a collection of Union buttons that we have in the archives of Michigan. These date from the 30s, the ones I'm showing here. And on the right there is a photo of a car that Walter Reuther used while he was recruiting for the UAW back in the 1930s. There was supposedly a sound system, picked up with a sound system, so he could drive around and talk and try to recruit. Moving on, 1936 election, and this is where you start seeing that FDR won by a landslide. Not only did FDR win by a landslide, the Democrats gained a huge majority in Congress. And what's more, in Michigan specifically, Frank Murphy, a very prominent New Deal Democrat, was elected. Now, Frank Murphy is the man who is shaking FDR's hand in this photo on top of the train. He was a former mayor of Detroit, was also a recorder's court judge, and he was a friend of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt sent him to be governor general of the Philippines earlier in the 1930s. By 1936, he talked Murphy into coming back to Michigan and running for governor. Michigan at this time was a heavily Republican state, but FDR thought he could win one for the Democrats there, and he did. Frank Murphy also won the election. And Frank Murphy, it should be noted, was considered a friend of labor, going back to when he was mayor of Detroit. In his campaign in 1936, he had noted that he didn't see himself being able to send out troops to fire on strikers, on workers, or people who were just trying to make a living. So when you see so many other stories in the past about governors sending out the National Guard or sending out the state troops or whatever have you, Murphy kind of said right away that he was going to be very reluctant to do that. Labor took notice. And right away, the CIO was sort of, with John Lewis, the president of the CIO, he was looking at industries that he could target to try and bring about so many reforms where he can make a headway and then get other industries maybe to follow suit. He was thinking of the steel industry. He was looking at the automobile industry. As it happened, forces aligned. The automobile industry won that argument, that everything, partly in a large part because there was a governor in Michigan that was more friendly to unions. Thus, it is no coincidence that on December 30th, 1936, 2 days before Frank Murphy took office, the Flint sit-down strike began. You've probably heard of the Flint sit-down strike. I have to slow down when I say Flint sit-down strike because I find out my tongue gets tied here. Obviously, it was a landmark strike. Now, I am going to note it was not the first sit-down strike by any means. It wasn't even the first sit-down strike in 1936. But you're taking on GM with this one. This is going to gain you a lot of attention. Plus, I mean, they won concessions. The General Motors ultimately agreed to recognize the union. Also, sit-down strikes. This is also the one that began the trend. It began this trend of encouraging more other people to strike, but also beginning a trend of sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes were wonderful for the workers, as opposed to, rather than standing outside holding picket signs, being exposed to the elements, possibly being exposed to, hecklers and police officers who might possibly come in, try to disperse you. For a sit-down strike, you're occupying of the plant. You're occupying the employer's premises. In this case, they began with occupying the first two Fisher Body automobile plants that GM owned, and all they had to do was, go occupy one plant, and you shut down all of GM's operations just like that. And again, they're inside where it's warm, and as I said, this started at the end of December. And it was easier for them to keep morale up. I mean, you can see here, they're sitting in comfy seats, comfy automobile seats. They even slept in those automobile seats. So very nice. It was a win all the way around. The one problem we had with sit-down strikes is there was a huge debate, are these legal? Frank Murphy, in fact, wasn't so sure that they were. Now, the argument for them being illegal is that essentially you're trespassing. You're just sitting there, you're occupying somebody else's property. That was the argument. The General Motors, in fact, did go before a judge, called off and pleaded for an injunction against the strikers, and they were granted one. However, it was soon determined that the judge that granted that injunction was a major stockholder in General Motors. So there was a conflict of interest. That delayed things for a while. Eventually, another injunction was brought against the strikers. The strikers refused to disperse. And surprisingly, Governor Murphy was decided, he held to what he said in his campaign. He was very reluctant to send in the National Guard, and he didn't. He was very active in trying to negotiate a settlement, which he successfully did. And it ended up successfully with General Motors endorsing the union. And as I said, this brought a huge wave of strikes. According to one source I read, there were, and this is the country as a whole, not just Michigan, there were 4,700 strikes in the year 1937 alone, just 1937. Of that number, 500 of them, or around there, were sit-down strikes. So again, this is one that started a trend. I'm going to, just as an aside note here, Chrysler also ended up recognizing the union not too long after this. There was a big, the UAW hit Chrysler next, and Chrysler conceded to recognizing the union. Ford was a holdout. Ford did not. In fact, that same year, there was the famed Battle of the Overpass, which you may have heard of. It entailed a lot of Ford employees beating a lot of union representatives, just physically beating them. One of them, and notably, was Walter Reuther was beaten at the Battle of the Overpass. Ford, as I said, did not recognize the union until 1941, but that Battle of the Overpass helped gain the union a lot of sympathy. Plus, it gained visibility for Walter Reuther, who would go on to become very prominent, very visible in the labor movement going forward. But as I said, this sit-down strike started the trend. Strikes. Again, 4,700 in 1937 alone, the country as a whole. Detroit especially became known for strikes and sit-down strikes. One reporter in the Detroit News and opinion piece made the comment that striking had replaced baseball as a national pastime, because it seemed like they were reading headlines about strikes every day. I have a couple of photos from the Archives of Michigan here that I posted, and I just want to talk about why I posted these couple. Don't have time, obviously, to go into every strike. On the right there, we have a strike from the Hillcrest Bakery with two women who are striking, who are sleeping, occupying the premises. Now, I picked this one because showing that there were a lot of women also active in these strikes. And in fact, there were a number of prominent strikes with industries with predominantly female employees. In Detroit specifically, cigar union makers went on strike in 1937. This was an occupation. There was cigar factories in Detroit at this time, and it was largely women working that cigar factories, and they went on strike in 1937. Also in 1937, a very prominent Detroit strike, which was primarily female strikers, was the Woolworth retail workers went on strike, and they gained a raise going on that strike. They gained concessions, but it was very visible, because I mean, it's right downtown. People shop Woolworth all the time, gained a lot of publicity, and the fact that it was all predominantly women striking, obviously gained a lot of publicity, a lot of sympathy, worked really well. This second photo that I've chosen is from the Lansing Labor Holiday from June of 1937. I've done a lot of research on this one myself because I sort of became fascinated on this labor holiday. It was a day when literally the whole city just shut down. The workers convinced the populace to shut down the city. I don't have time. I'm not going to go into how all of that happened, but in the gist of it is that the head of the local UAW, he and his wife had both had warrants out for their arrest because they were refusing a court injunction to disperse a strike. The sheriff arrived at their house at 2 a.m. The man wasn't there. His wife was. She was also very active in the union leader, so there's a reason she was also on the warrant. And the police arrested her, left the 2 children at home. So right away, her husband saw the opportunity. He called all the factory foremen, all the union people, and said, we're calling a citywide strike. And the whole city, again, just shut down. They were using cars to block streets. All the businesses closed, and it was the populace largely closing in sympathy. This has been argued. Some people have called this a general strike. That's disputed. The definition of a general strike being one in which it's not just the union workers, the whole population joins with the workers in shutting down. Now, some argue this isn't a real general strike because the aims were limited. It was just they were calling for release of the prisoners. A real general strike supposedly would only be one in which it would be a more open class warfare. General strikes very rare in the United States. This is not the only one. It's one of the few. So it's notable for that reason. But I also think for my topic here, it's notable because it shows how much popular support that, again, the union was enjoying at this time, possibly more than ever before. Surprisingly, now we come to the Supreme Court. This was always the case. Is the Supreme Court going to knock down the Wagner Act? Are we going to go back with collective bargaining not being a recognized right? Well, as it happens, in 1937, they heard a case involving the Wagner Act and they upheld it. Surprise. Now, I was talking about putting a pin in the whole court packing discussion. What happened here is that the Supreme Court was basically seeing the writing on the wall. The Democrats were winning elections. The political tide had turned. People were seeing much more sympathy with strikers. They saw where the wind was blowing. They also saw how popular FDR was, that he was going to be in office in a while. He was going to be able to appoint judges eventually. And he in fact appointed notably Hugo Black, a very liberal judge on the Supreme Court while he was president. And they saw all this and they realized that they have to make some concessions. And they agreed to the Wagner Act. Now, interestingly enough, by the time they agreed to this in April, and it wasn't too long, about mid-1937, strikes are starting to taper off a little bit. People are already winning great concessions. But you also see that all this wave of strikes, all this activity, you naturally, as you see in many of such instances, there's a backlash. We're talking about backlashes and reversals. Common complaint of the right was always charging communism with unions, for example. And of course, there were some communists in unions. Definitely, of course there were. But they're also not all of them. And when Lindsay was talking about Woodbridge Ferris and how his moderation, I got a flash of what I wanted to talk about. So I'm gonna call back to that, because there were definitely people in the unions too that thought, you people are too radical. We have to be able to compromise. If you get too far to the left, we're going to lose all sympathy. We're going to lose everything we've gained. There was definitely that mindset in a lot of unions as well. So union workers, of course, not being of one mind. You see differences in that. And you also saw opponents, people more, even in the general populace, there was some of this union activity. Some people were great about it, but there were also people who thought it went too far. And I'm going to talk about one of them in particular, Martin Dies. Martin Dies was a Democrat from Texas. He was a conservative Democrat from Texas. He was a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And actually, he stated in 1937, because of all these strikes, oh my God, it's gone too far. The unions have too much power. He was just afraid about this. And soon he becomes chairman of what became the House, the famed House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. HUAC, of course, is much more famous for its activities in the late 40s, early 50s under Joseph McCarthy. But before Joseph McCarthy took it over in the late 30s and much of the 40s, it was known as the Dies Committee. It's always been sort of amusing to me. Michigan at one point had the Michigan legislature formed its own version of the House Un-American Activities for the state. And people derisively referred to it as the Little Dies Committee, which I thought was very clever. little dies, meaning you never stop talking about communism, you people. So that there was definitely more of an anti-union backlash, but anti-union flavor and concerns about, oh my God, the communists, as Red Scare, as you know, would happen more later. Also, I will note in 1938, Frank Murphy loses the re-election. Probably not all because of the unions. I should point out here too, Frank Murphy actually won very handily in Detroit itself. Michigan was still more rural, just like today. The rural communities tended to be more conservative, and they were more frightened by, what they saw as uprising and disorder in the Detroit in the unions. So that's one reason. It's also worth noting, and this has been pointed out, that Frank Murphy did not have FDR on the ticket when he ran in 1938. Governor terms in Michigan at that time were 2 years rather than 4. So when he ran in 1938, it was an off presidential election year. He did not have FDR, and Michigan at this point was still a Republican state. And just a little trivial note here: the man he lost to was the same man that he beat in 1936, which was Republican Frank Fitzgerald. Finally, I will note the Supreme Court actually did declare sit-down strikes illegal in 1939, so that ended that. Little postscript on the Wagner Act here. That you see this sign. This is Mr. President, veto the Hartley-Taft slave labor bill. After World War II, the country naturally swung a little bit more to the right. The economy was better. We just won the war. The Republicans gained control of Congress. And in 1947, this Taft-Hartley Act, this bill was introduced, and it undid many of the provisions of the Wagner Act. You can see the end. True to this sign here, President Harry Truman did veto the Hartley-Taft Act. Did not help him. The Congress overrode his veto. So that was the end. So again, you can sort of see this pendulum. It swings one way, it swings the other, and it seems to always be thus. But certainly they did gain concessions in 1937. Certainly labor unions, I think, got to be more acceptable. So there were gains, but there's a step forward, there's a step back too. And I think with that, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you. It sounds like the vein in all three of our speakers' tales appears to be simple. The strikes and the legislation failed in the end. Today, Michigan is a right to work state along with 27 other states in the union. Late in The Women of the Copper Country, Ella Bloor is chatting with Eva, a young protester who is discouraged that the strikes aren't resulting in immediate change. Ella says to Eva, "What's the use? Is that what you want to ask? Because in the long run, we can make things better." She then goes on to paraphrase abolitionist Theodore Parker's 1850 speech. "The arc of the moral universe is strong, but it bends towards justice." While these immediate instances fail, the idea of unions themselves have not. Without them, most of us would not have an 8-hour day, health benefits, or I'm sorry, I got thrown off, or safety requirements. Even today, workers are uniting to fight for themselves and others. We see that with each Starbucks that votes to unionize and with the recent railway strikes. Perhaps then we should consider each of these instances as more of a pendulum, like Bob suggested. We see the world swing away from the idea of unions, but inevitably the world always swings back. With that, I would love to open this up for questions. All right, I have one. I guess I'm just curious, are you members of a union? Full disclosure, I am the alternate steward of our local Teamsters. So I'm just interested to hear if you guys are members of a union.
Yes, I am. I'm a member of the AUP-AFT at Wayne State University. I'm also the political action coordinator for our local.
Yeah, I'll
Um,
jump in. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Go ahead,
I
Bob.
figured we go in speaker order, so I was gonna let you go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I am not presently. Michigan Tech academic staff is not unionized, but there are unions at the university, and we do have union employment within the library. I have been in a union when I worked for the DC Public Library. When I lived in Washington, DC, they were unionized with the city government.
Okay. And yes, I am a member of the union. In fact, I'm actually in the United Auto Workers, which may seem strange, but that is the union that represents us in my section of state government. And I can't really tell you why it's the UAW, but it is, and that's who I pay dues to. So there you go.
First things first, too, I also want to thank you for staying on the line. As you can see, we ran way over, so much so that you could hear the announcement of the library. Since we're over in for a penny, in for a pound, I'd love to know what's the most interesting fact you learned in your research.
Okay, I guess I'll go first since we're doing order. Most interesting fact was, well, one, I had no idea about the furniture being so powerful, and facts about how the corset was remade. But relating to the workers themselves, I wasn't too surprised with a lot of the issues that were going on, but how the women in Kalamazoo had to share the washrooms with men that were abusing them and being trapped in there with them. And we know that in the 1912, sanitary conditions were horrible. And when they describe sores of unseemly like character, I can't even imagine. It's a fact that I will always keep and always tell people to give an example of what unions have done to solve things and move things along.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the threads that last the decades and into the century. Like looking at Mother Bloor being in Calumet, like physically, like on the ground, like marching in parades, like talking with union members, like people that were on strike. And then her autobiography inspiring Woody Guthrie to write that song, or, you know, images of her marching in Calumet inspiring artworks, or, you know, Mary Doria Russell being inspired to include Bloor in her historical novel. You know, the fact that this was a real person that was supportive and a champion of the labor cause has had impact that stretched the decades, and I think she'll continue to have that influence. And I could say the same thing for Big Annie, like these women or these people, even because there are men that had similar threads that are still being tugged along through history. And I think that's what I find most fascinating, is the pieces of the tapestry that people latch onto, and then there's a whole dynamic network that gets created, fact, fiction, and otherwise, about these people and the things that they did in their lives and the impact it had, large and small.
Well, for me, I always interested in politics. I just love reading about all the various personalities involved. And Frank Murphy, frankly, has always been my favorite Michigan governor. He just seems like a man of great integrity. And I liked reading a little bit more about him, learning a little bit more. And to find out, apparently he had a really strong relationship with Francis Perkins, who's the Secretary of Labor under the FDR. And they were very good friends. And I was reading a little bit about how they ended up being such good friends as they were working together. And I thought that was just sort of neat. So I guess I'll throw that out.
All right, one final question, and I promise you we'll wrap up after that. Is there something that you didn't include in your talk that you wish you had had time to address?
About half of it. I really wanted to get more involved with not only saying that with the situations we saw with Kalamazoo and with Grand Rapids, and it seemed like there was failures. It seemed like they didn't accomplish what they wanted to. But just to remind people that, especially with union people or social justice people, it's those who are in these actions, you plant the tree not for yourself, but for the future generations to enjoy the shade and the fruit. And that's what they were doing, unbeknownst of themselves. They were doing that because we wouldn't have been able to accomplish the goals that we wanted to try to do in the 1930s, and then also in the 1950s and the 1960s. I'm not going to talk about the 80s because that was a mess, but that's what they were leading to. So, wish I could have elaborated more on that.
Yeah, I think for me as a student of rhetoric, I wish I would have had more time to really walk through some of the language of these instances of memory. And so like the lyrics of Woody's song or the actual textual visual image and the text itself that were at the Italian Hall site, like talking about like the words that were changed when the signage was changed or the impact of Guthrie's lyricism, because it really does shape how we think about things and what we choose to believe or what we choose to affirm or disavow. And I think I would implore people to go and look at the lyrics for Guthrie's 1913 massacre song, or to just Google like Michigan Historic Signs Italian Hall and just read the text for yourself, because seeing change over time or seeing how charged up words might impact your own belief is really powerful, and I think it can create a lot of interesting conversation.
For me, honestly, this is always a thing. When I was reading, there was always a lot of side roads that I really would like to have traveled. But I guess the main one I will point out in here is I talked about the CIO as being more open to minorities and recruiting for more people. I really would have loved to have delved into that, and I wish I had had time to do so. So I guess I would have to point that out as the main one.
With that, are there any last minute questions from the audience? I'm going to take a look real quick, but I don't think so. All right, then. Well, again, I want to thank you all for hanging on much longer than expected. I very much enjoyed all of your talks, and thank you again. And I hope we all had a good time, or at least learned something. And with that, have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.